Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, Canada. Thank you so much for tuning into the program. You're listening to Lawton Online on the Rebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton, and it is so great to have you on the show. Another day, another terrorist attack. I guess another week. But still, this has become routine. In fact, much of my monologue on the show last week was about this very idea that terrorism is now routine. I didn't realize when I said that immediately following, the days would bring an attack against Christians, specifically women and children, in a park in Lahore, Pakistan. Now, people, generally speaking, and I say generally here because this is very important, but people generally do not follow as closely attacks like this that happen in places like Pakistan, India, etc., because they are a heck of a lot more normal in those places than they are in countries like Belgium, France, Canada, for now anyway. We can't take that for granted. But this one struck very close to home for me as a Christian. Christians make up about 2% of the population in Pakistan. Some estimates say maybe as much as 5%, but mostly we could say 2%. And they exist essentially without the same protections that Muslims in Pakistan do. Terrorism there is extremely common, and after this attack, it did not take long for, you guessed it, a terrorist group connected to the Taliban to take credit for the attack. And what I found interesting was that the targeting of innocent Christians, children, women, etc., was not enough to raise the attention of most Western leaders. They offered their, of course, feckless sympathies and condolences to all the victims, etc., but didn't mention that, hey, Christians are being persecuted. I wonder why the government is now not opening the door to Pakistani Christian refugees who would like to seek refuge in this country where they enjoy religious freedoms. Why are we not opening the floodgates for them? I'll tell you why. It's the same reason we're not opening the floodgates for Yazidi Christians, for a number of other Christians who exist as persecuted religious minorities in countries, mostly Muslim countries, around the world. And that's because this government does not care. The West does not care about the plight of Christian minorities in countries where it's almost worthy of death to become a Christian. We're not bringing in Christians from Iran. No, we're focused on Syrian Muslim refugees. And there's a reason for that. These people are also fleeing persecution. Christians aren't the only victims in the world, but they are certainly the ones being ignored by the West. And it's undeniable. But the ignorance that the West holds right now about events going on in other parts of the world is not limited to persecution of Christian minorities. No, there is a huge level of ignorance here. Still, a great level of ignorance from this federal government, the Justin Trudeau government, that there is even a war going on right now. I talked about this a little bit last week on the show. He says, we're not at war, even with the Brussels attack. And then we have U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, who in an interview following Brussels says, we're winning the war. We, as the West, are winning the war. I don't know how we can be winning a war that some Western leaders haven't even acknowledged being a part of yet, which is perhaps why I don't have a great deal of optimism here. Now, fellow Rebel Faith Goldy, who hosts On the Hunt, which you can watch here on The Rebel on Thursdays, had a brilliant piece about this in her program last week, and I wanted to reiterate it, or have her rather reiterate it. She's much better to do that than I am, and also update it with new information about why it's so important that we recognize that, hey, we are losing right now when we look at the fight against Daesh, the fight against the Islamic State, which is synonymous in many ways with the fight against global jihad. ISIS is just one of the biggest faces of that global jihad movement right now. So are we winning or are they winning? Joining me to talk about this and break this down is fellow Rebel Faith Goldy. Wonderful to talk to you again, Faith. Thanks so very much for your time today.
Thanks very much for having me, Andrew.
You covered in your latest show this very question, but from a very different perspective, I would suggest, from what I heard about it, as to where we are in the fight against this group.
Right. Well, my thesis was one that actually has since been echoed by Obama's own CIA deputy leader, which is that ISIS is winning. And unfortunately, when you look at both Secretary of State John Kerry and our own Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, they have a very one-dimensional understanding of this war that we are up against global jihad. First thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to this new threat, and I use the term new very loosely, of course, I mean, I suppose if we were to put kind of an earmark on where things started, at least when it comes to our modern war, really 9/11, that there's more than one theater. So while John Kerry might be looking at certain key assets that we've won back when we look at the war in Iraq and Syria, of course, we're in asymmetrical warfare, which means what? Our enemies aren't state actors. They are not a traditional army, right? These guys, namely ISIS and even their so-called competing group Al-Qaeda, you don't need a membership card. You don't need a passport. All you have to say is, I swear allegiance to these guys, and now I can strap on any sort of anarchist cookbook bomb to myself, to my wife, to my dog, and run into an airport. And guess what? You don't even have to get past the screening anymore. These guys figured out. You can do it at a bloody check-in counter where there is no screening. And when it comes to what Justin Trudeau said, that we are no longer at war, or more accurately, really, Stéphane Dion, what these guys are doing, our elected leaders, is that they're using international jargon to define war. And I would say, and these sentiments are actually echoed in a lot of academia, that our international jargon is way out of date. I mean, they're traditionally, they're used to dealing with Britain versus France, not us versus Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So for him to be using this sort of rhetoric to define what we are up against is silly. But to get our head out of the clouds for a second, ISIS has declared war on us. And when I say us, I mean everyone in the West. They have, yes, even named out Canada individually. And when you look at the events over the last week, Andrew, between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, 144 non-combatants, innocent civilians lost their lives, at least. Over hundreds and hundreds of them, on top of that, are injured. It is impossible for any elected official to tell me that we are winning right now.
How do we define winning in this context? Because one of the things that Secretary Kerry used to justify his position was that 40% of the territory that Daesh held has been taken back. He says revenues being cut, leadership's being taken apart. I would look at the question of winning as being one of, is the conflict still escalating or is it de-escalating? And I don't think we can say that it's de-escalating.
Absolutely. And I think that if you take your definition, sort of my landscape, you have somewhat of a tangible answer, which is so long as things are de-escalating on several fronts. You know, it's easy for us to point, well, you know, here in Raqqa or here in Mosul, we have regained certain oil fields or certain, key entry points and crossways. That's great. And I'm really happy for that. But guess what? I don't live in Syria. I don't live in Iraq. I live in Canada, and I share the same sorts of airports as the people in Brussels, Belgium. I go to the same sorts of theaters as the people in the Bataclan, Paris. That is my life. And so that front, that theater is more important to me. And that is the front, and that is a theater that we are losing.
Where do we go from here? I know it's, for us in Canada anyway, a first step to get our government to even react and identify that there is in fact a war going on. But let's say that we could flip a switch. The government starts to recognize its role in this conflict, whether they want to be there or not. How do we defeat it? How do we scale it back?
Right. Well, first of all, I think that not to sound too much like a liberal right now, but there's no one simple solution. This is a sophisticated and complex problem. And so it will take a sophisticated and complex methods in attacking. I think, first of all, we as Western nations, especially those that are part of the Atlantic Treaty, which is to say NATO, we need to up our military commitments to that 2% of GDP spending. Right now, we are significantly below that. Without adequate militaries, we are unable to frankly make the terrorists more afraid of us than we are of them. Secondly of all, we have to start harmonizing our security and intelligence agencies, both within our borders and then between our borders, which is to say what? The CIA and the Pentagon are arming two different parts of Syria, and right now those parts are combating against each other, which means the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. We saw it even with our own attack on our Parliament Hill, right? The certain officials, the security officials outside, could not communicate with other officials indoors. We have to start harmonizing, first of all, on a domestic level, our security intelligence forces, and then start communicating with other nations that are like-minded and part of our own treaty organization.
And to go to your first point there, when you talk about military spending, I also want to use this opportunity to remind people in the budget that much needed infrastructure that the Defense Department was planning on purchasing, that is necessary, that everyone, even the most critical of military spending, realizes we need, new equipment, etc., no money for it.
Right, and I'm so happy you brought that up, Andrew, because this is a government that is so obsessed with their own navel gazing, and we have to get that seat on the UN Security Council, the UN of all places, Saudi loving and corrupt as it is. Okay, they have made sure that there are hundreds of millions available for the CBC and Aboriginal education, some of which are noble causes, but at this juncture in time, climate change is not more likely to kill us than terrorism, right? We have to prioritize. That's part of being in elected government. And right now, the greatest threat that is facing Western civilization is that of global jihad. And when you do not equip our security intelligence forces with that which they are begging, they are screaming from the rooftops, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, President Barack Obama, this is what we need in order to do our jobs given these new threats in today's unpredictable and unprecedented, threatening world. When you don't give them what they're looking for, how do you expect them to do their job? And then how do you expect us to then prevent or at least mitigate these sorts of terrorist acts in the future? And just to mention, by the way, when it comes to NATO, I'm a big believer in NATO, the UN, G7, /G8, G20. These are not our guys with guns. NATO is. When it comes to Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, these are the guys who got in there and got the job done. They are not involved as much as they should be when it comes to the fight against the Islamic State right now. And I think that if we did have them involved, then that would incentivize governments like Canada, which is, we're not at war, to become more involved. And if I may quickly say that we, as a people, have to start thinking, frankly, like Israelis. When you leave an unintended baggage at a Tel Aviv airport, everyone starts yelling, bomb, 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 like unattended luggage. We need to have that sort of situational awareness that, frankly, has been beaten out of us as 21st century civilians. We do not think like that anymore. We have no situational awareness of the dangers that might be around us. And if we do think, hey, that guy looks a little fishy and his jacket looks a little puffy and his bags are weird and he keeps on making eye contact and getting on the cell phone with that guy over there, we don't say anything about it. We just are like, well, I'm just going to go about and hopefully make my way down to, Fort Myers without a hitch. We have to also be vigilant and call out any sort of weirdness. And that might sound awful. That might, there might be people who are listening now and say, Andrew, then we're letting the terrorists win. No, we're letting the terrorists win when we do nothing. It's time we start doing something. And
one point that you raised a couple of moments ago that I wanted to revisit here is that we have, as Canada, not been singled out specifically for being Canadian as far as being an enemy of Daesh, but as a Western country, as a free country, we have been targeted because their beef is with the entire West here, which means that we're not combating this as an individual country. We're combating it as a global community. But I don't think we're pulling our weight in Canada, and I know there are other European countries that aren't as well in particular, but how do we if we can't even get Canada on board to do what you and I both know is required here, how can we expect that the entire West will fight this with the amount of force that is required?
Right. A few things here. First of all, and I don't mean to correct you on your own show here, but it was actually during the nascent stages of ISIS, Canada was specifically called out when there were a bunch of men. They were standing around. It was during a video. It was probably not very well propagated, which is to say, we played a few times back when the old school Sun News.
Oh no, I'm not denying that point. I'm talking about it's not just us that they have an issue with. That was the point I was making.
Pardon my ignorance. But
no, you're
if
fine.
we don't do it, then how about everyone else?
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that we have been conditioned. Since the time of 9/11, we've been told not to call terrorism, not to call terrorists. Instead, there's workplace violence by the militants. On top of that, we've been told that we cannot criticize Islam lest we be labeled Islamophobes. We've been told that the problem is not with these jihadists, but with our own foreign policy, our YouTube videos, and our cartoons of Muhammad. We're told that we have allies in the Middle East, and that's what led us to basically totally mess up the Arab Spring and then eventually partner up with Syrian terrorists who buddy up with the likes of Al Qaeda, which is to say what? We've taken a lot of really bad steps, Andrew. We're in a really, really dark place right now. And as a society, we have been conditioned not to question it. We have been conditioned not to push back against the main thesis and narrative that's been given to us by our political elected leaders, a lot of our police officials, who are frankly under their direction, and been told not to even question our PC neighbors. As the West, we have to stop with the effeminate solidarity that says that hugging a Muslim will solve terrorism, that putting a particular Facebook filter on my profile picture will stop terrorism. We have to stop it with all the political correctness. I think if we do that as a first step, we will be onto a better road at providing some sort of antithesis to the madness that has totally overtaken our globe right now.
Faith Goldy joining me on the line, host of On the Hunt on The Rebel, which is every Thursday. So you can catch Faith this week, and it will be a phenomenal show as always, I suspect. Faith, thanks so much for your time as always.
Andrew, you're the best. Thanks so much.
This denial isn't just apparent with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I actually had the opportunity the other day to interview the Belgian ambassador to Canada, Raoul Delcard, about the attacks in Brussels. And it was guest hosting on the Roy Green Show. And what happened was I was asking him about, okay, what is your country doing to prevent this? What is your country doing to make sure this doesn't happen again? And there was one section of the interview, I'm not going to play the whole interview, but there was one section of the interview I wanted to focus on, which is asking about if Belgium's place in the European Union, basically the European state, and open borders and free mobility between all these countries perhaps work to the detriment of Belgium. And I want to play for you the question and the answer so you understand what it is I might be pinpointing here as being problematic. When we look at this idea of mobility, and this was something you mentioned just a moment ago, Canadians might not have experienced this firsthand, but it's very easy to get around different countries in the European Union. Does that make it, from a security perspective, more difficult to protect yourselves against it because it's so easy, relatively speaking, for people to get into different countries?
Oh, obviously. My country is very flat. We are not protected by high mountains. And if you look back at the history of Belgium in the 19th century, even the beginning of the 20th, we were like the battlefield of Europe because it was so easy to occupy the country. Today, with Schengen and the free movement of people and EU citizens, access to Belgium is indeed facilitated. By the way, let me underline the fact that my country still defends very much this opening of the borders, of course. But on the other side, this has to be balanced by a closer security watch. But indeed, to answer your question, yes, the geography to some extent would not help us too much.
Does that not make it very difficult to prevent people who don't belong in your country from getting in when you have to rely on Europe as a whole to protect itself rather than being able to protect your own borders as a country?
Yes, but I think really that borders do not matter too much to the terrorist organization, really. And terrorism has been globalized now, and really you cannot seal the border. You have actually to develop other techniques to identify the potential threat, which are sometimes people which have been living in the country for months, if not years.
So we're back to the podcast now. What you just heard was him saying borders do not matter to terrorists. Now, I agree with that when worded that way. Borders do not matter to terrorists, but they certainly matter to countries. And they matter to terrorists if you secure them and stop terrorists from getting into your country. And I realize there are some geographic issues here. Belgium is not going to be able to effortlessly defend its borders the way that Canada can, in some sections of it anyway. Or the way that the United States wants to with its Mexican border if Donald Trump becomes president. I mean, these are things that are expensive to do. They're costly to do. In some cases, you have to rely on natural terrain, but they can at least do something because in the same breath, he also says, well, we also still defend opening the borders. So clearly the European Union is failing its member states by not having accurate intelligence, by not arresting and detaining terrorists. These people, many of the ones implicated in the Brussels attacks, were known to authorities. In fact, the one of the masterminds of it anyway, quite honestly deported, even though he had a Belgian passport, to the Netherlands by Turkish officials who say they warned the Belgian government about the fact that, hey, he's likely to be a terrorist. But once you're in, you're in. Once you're in a European Union country, you are in the whole continent. You can go wherever you want, plan whatever terrorist attack you want, and get even from France to Brussels and back. Where we now know that these terrorists were behind both operations. The November attacks in Paris, which killed more than 130 lives, and the Belgian attacks, which killed 31, I believe, and injured countless more. This is the attitude that we need to quash. This denial in the global community as to what terrorism is and, more importantly, how it can be stopped. And yes, you can combat it through intelligence, but you also need force. And that comes through immigration protections. That comes through securing borders. And, you know, there was a great point raised by Faith Goldy in that interview a few moments ago that, you know what, they don't even need to get through airport security anymore. They'll say, hey, we'll just blow up the check-in counter. Terrorists evolve, terrorists adapt, but we can certainly make it difficult and stop them to buy us enough time to do more on this issue. But for the love of all that is good, Prime Minister Trudeau must recognize that there is, in fact, a war going on. Whether he wants to be in it or not, we are. More Lawton Online coming up in just a couple of moments here on the Rebel.media. Stay with us.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on the Rebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Welcome back to Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media. This next interview I've been looking forward to sharing with you all week. It's just a wonderful, wonderful subject here, and one that needs to be acknowledged, one that people need to pay attention to. And simply put, we can boil it down to a question. Are men dealt an unfair hand? In life, in popular culture, in academia, in the justice system? Have the scales supposed to be those of balance tipped in the favor of women against men? Now, there are some who may listen, probably not many Rebel listeners, who would scoff and say, that's terrible. Men are the oppressors, the patriarchy, war on women, all that sort of stuff, Gamergate, everything like that. I don't even know what Gamergate is, by the way, but I know it's connected to these topics. And I know that my colleague, Lauren Southern, is the go-to expert on that. People are saying, no. Men are the evil ones here. Women are the ones against whom the deck is stacked. But there are academics and researchers and lawyers that are looking at a very different picture, which is that, well, that was once the case, undeniably so. Men are now the oppressed. The war on men, or as it's more technically known, misandry, which is ultimately the male counterpart to the much-touted misogyny, which is apparent in, I'm told, every corner of the world here. And misandry is actually the subject of research of two Canadian academics, Doctors Katherine Young and Paul Nathanson, who have written 4 books on the topic, and they're in the process of writing several more. The first, going back just after 2001, I believe, 2001 or 2002, was called Spreading Misandry. They also published in the series Legalizing Misandry, Sanctifying Misandry, and most recently, just a couple of months ago, Replacing Misandry, A Revolutionary History of Men. And this is a topic that does not get much play. In fact, most people probably couldn't even tell you what the word misandry is. And even those who could, many of them would just decry that such a concept could even exist. But it's an important issue to discuss. We've seen in custody battles, as an example, how the family courts are skewed against men. We've seen how insulting men, making fun of men, leaving men out of an equation. As we've seen in the University of Manitoba's new diversity quotas that I was talking about last week, how this is all par for the course now. So what is misandry? How do we fight it? And more importantly, how do we get people to realize that it's even a problem? Very pleased to welcome Dr. Katherine Young to the program. She is one of the co-authors of the Misandry series and also a professor emerita at McGill University. Dr. Young, thank you very much for joining me today. I so greatly appreciate your time.
Yes, I'm glad to talk to you.
So you have been covering this topic of misandry in a number of books going back about 15 years now when Spreading Misandry was published, co-authored by your colleague, Dr. Nathanson, and yourself. Let me first ask you here, because this is a word that a lot of people are not familiar with, certainly not as much as the word misogyny. So just to give listeners that might not be as familiar a good context here, what is misandry?
Well, misandry is the contempt or hatred of men, and it's the sexist counterpart of misogyny.
This is something that you speak of in very strong language, but does this really have a wider umbrella underneath it? I mean, mocking men, joking about men, things that ultimately seem like double standards that you could never do with women. Is that tantamount to misandry in your eyes?
Yes, it is. And we started this project in the mid-'80s and really tracked it carefully through the '90s. In fact, we had collected so much information at that point that it was going to be one book, but with multiple angles. In point of fact, we've divided that book up and divided it again and again, so there are now 4 books and 2 more before we complete this project. So it's a pervasive phenomenon. When we looked at popular culture, we looked at jokes and greeting cards and box office hit films, TV shows, and we found an image of men that was almost always inadequate, evil, or what we called honorary women.
Talk to me a little bit about that. What does the honorary woman designation mean as it pertains to this?
Okay, well, that's really images of men created by women, and there are a number of men who buy into that in the sense that they are male feminists or in alliance with feminists. Sometimes they're minority men in a film, and because of that alliance between feminism and minority traditions, there is an alliance there, and we call these people the honorary women, doing what women like in terms defined by women.
So this is sort of going down that road of the fantasy man that doesn't really exist in reality, that women would be talking about, that sort of vision.
Yes, if they ascribe to the values that women want. I mean, there's a number of things where men, for good reason, should and do ascribe to things that women want. We don't want to paint this thing as terribly negative, but we ask the question, what does a healthy male identity mean today? And we find the old cross-cultural pattern, and there were always exceptions, but the big pattern was being a provider, a protector, and a progenitor. So none of those are distinctive anymore. And we feel that there's a growing crisis of male identity because of that inability to define something that is distinctive and culturally valued by society. Well, and men can't claim to be providers as a definition of manhood or protectors, because women do these things now. and even progenitor, which is fatherhood. There's sperm banks, and so that notion of fatherhood can be reduced to what we call a teaspoon of sperm.
I would also go another level with that, which is that not only are there less defined roles for men as providers, et cetera, but also a lot of people seem to view that as an inherently sexist ideal, that if you talk about a male being a provider, that in and of itself is misogynistic. That seems to have really clouded the discussion on this.
Yes, this is exactly the issue. I mean, it's not that we want to go back to, women at home, at least elite women at home, middle class women at home, and men in the workplace. We're not trying to turn back the hands of time with this, but we do think we need to move toward a point of, first of all, hearing men's voices and taking them seriously so that they're part of the conversation, not bystanders where other people define the terms of manhood. And how this works out has no easy solution to it, but we feel that to move forward we need what we call a level playing field. For a long time it was that women needed that level playing field, but now we feel that we need to take the concerns of men more seriously. Concerns such as the high suicide rate for men, the dropout from school, the devastating effects of chronic unemployment. So many issues need to be come to the foreground and be discussed. And very often it's just a forbidden topic.
You mentioned in that response this equalizer that's needed to level the playing field, and you also acknowledged in that same breath that this is something that women needed for the longest time. Was there one pivotal point, or at least a span of a few years, when the pendulum had moved from one side to the other? All of a sudden, women were dealt a better hand than men, by and large?
I think that was the period of the 90s where we were, focusing on what women were saying. So we read so many feminist books at that time, and as you saw, we looked at popular culture. Another book was called Legalizing Misandry, and we could see although one was always supposed to have gender-neutral language in law, we could see how it often was in favor of women when you read interpretations into the law, when the courts came into play, when the police came into play, and we detected a lot of double standards.
Oh, and we've certainly seen that with custody issues as well, where there seem to be a lot of men that are just completely left out of the system, if you will.
That's it. So custody, well, in that Legalizing Misandry book, we looked at custody, we looked at child support, we looked at parental alienation, we looked at prostitution, we looked at of course, violence against women. We looked at domestic violence, all of those issues. And, there are serious cases with women. And the difficulty of this discussion is not to belittle those problems or try to detract from them, but to say, look, there are cases where there is domestic violence against men. Where do they go for help? Where are the shelters for men? Where are the psychiatrists and the counselors and the social workers who are trained to listen to men carefully and take their needs and their concerns into consideration?
Going back from the first book in this series, Spreading Misandry, to Replacing Misandry, A Revolutionary History of Men, published this past year, how much has the field of research really changed in that time? I mean, how much did you really need to perhaps change course a little bit or expand the scope of your research just due to changes in this issue in that span of time?
Well, we're finding that there are changes underway right now, but they really haven't entered the universities so that there's good research being done.
Now, sorry, are these positive changes or negative changes?
Well, at the moment, we're seeing a turning point toward more positive changes, but it's very slow. We don't, as I just said, we don't see it in university research. It's still very hard to publish books on men, of getting these issues into peer-reviewed journals. A lot of the discussion goes on in private groups. It goes on the internet, on blogs, and very often those contexts the research doesn't come to the foreground. A lot of frustration and anger gets vented. So we've always argued that we need to have these discussions in the mainstream, in the universities, and in research institutes.
Obviously, universities and, the broader academic culture has really been where we've seen so much of the feminism that you described earlier on. I'm curious what the response has been to you and Dr. Nathanson in academic circles as you've unveiled and furthered your research.
Well, generally, we're just ignored. As I said, even to get reviews of our books have been hard. Luckily, McGill Queen's Press has been very solidly supportive of us and published this series. But it's hard to get this out there. Occasionally, when we give a lecture, we've had protests. We gave one in 2013. It was held in a University of Toronto classroom, and there were huge protests. And the topic, as it was advertised, had the word intersexual dialogue in it. In other words, the conversation between men and women. So, you would think you could at least use the language of dialogue. This wasn't the language of men's rights that people often fear is a language that will try to marginalize women's concerns. It's dialogue, and that caused protests. We did just give a lecture this week also at the University of University of Toronto, and we didn't have protests this time. So maybe that's a change. These topics may be at least allowed to be discussed, where before there was seriously an attempt to silence people that would be interested in men's issues.
With that being said, I know one of the common themes that you've looked at outside of academic circles has been misandry in popular culture. I'm curious if that has been, and we've seen it in advertising from commercials that are predicated on, dumb dads not knowing how to do certain things, or men falling into very simplistic stereotypes in sitcoms and movies, etc. Has that really been part of the guiding force of misandry in culture, or has that just been a reflection of a misandry in society that already existed?
I suspect it goes both ways. In other words, if there's a misandry in the general culture, then the people who create these programs, and sometimes they're men as well as women, they know that this sells, so to speak, that people are quite willing to cast aspersions on men, and it can enter a popular format. At the same time, you can get the creation of misandry out of those programs. So it goes both ways.
The one thing I wanted to close on here is, where do you see the positive outcome really deriving from here? Is this a change that people need to look at in their own lives? Is this a change that academic circles need to embrace? How can we really go back to what you said earlier and tip the scales to a more even footing?
Well, I think everybody, first of all, we talk about the fact that women went through a major transition where their consciousness was raised about the issues that affected women. And we think the same thing needs to happen with men, and it certainly has been happening. we think that just as women decided that they had to monitor the misogyny, and when they saw it in public forums to criticize it, men have to monitor, and those women who are concerned about men need to monitor this as well, whether it's complaining about advertisements that are negative toward men, or university courses that called gender that won't look at anything about men's history and men's movements and the concerns of men. So it needs to go on all levels.
I'm joined on the line by Professor Katherine Young, a woman specializing in this idea of misandry, something that I think needs to be more actively discussed than it is, and also co-author of the Misandry series alongside Dr. Paul Nathanson. Dr. Young, thank you so very much for your time this afternoon. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew.
And you know, this actually makes a perfect follow-up to the interview I did on last week's show with Maclean's editor-at-large, Peter Sean Taylor, and we were chatting about the University of Manitoba policy, the Teachers College policy, which basically has a special designated category for everyone but men, even though men are underrepresented in teachers and in Teachers College. Now, I don't care about that. I think there's probably a good reason for that, which is that men are less likely to enter that because they just don't want to. But to claim that it's other groups that are the victims of oppression in that and not recognize that, hey, oppression can exist against men, that is misandry. It's the very definition of misandry, or at the very least one of a mounting number of examples of it. And we can look at other ones as well. Family court came up in my preamble as well as in the interview with Dr. Young. And we can also look at domestic violence. 50% of all domestic violence victims, according to Statistics Canada, by the way, are men. How many abused men's shelters are there? In fact, most men who are victims of this are actually mocked relentlessly for it. I remember a few months ago, I interviewed a YouTube star, Matthew Santoro's his name, and I'd never heard of him before. But he made a video, a very tearful confession about being victimized by his ex-girlfriend. She, a fellow YouTube star, believe it or not, had hit him and was emotionally and verbally abusive to him. And a lot of people, much to their credit, lauded his bravery for coming out as a victim of violence, men's victimization by women. But a lot of people called him a wimp, laughed at him, said, "Suck it up, Buttercup," said, "Who cares? You got hit by a girl." Were mocking him relentlessly. And I interviewed him, and he was very put together in the interview. But in the video, when he made this initial confession, when he was in a more vulnerable place, it was bringing him to tears. It likely wasn't the physical pain that did it, but more the emotional pain of what happened. And I don't want to go down a road in this show of necessarily unearthing emotional pain of people, but I think it's important to note that this is a discussion that's absent, that, hey, this is something men have to deal with. High suicide rate among men. This is an issue near and dear to my heart as a survivor of a suicide attempt. As someone who has dealt with mental illness, the fact that men are disproportionately affected by this means, hey, this is an issue that men should talk about. Things like prostate cancer, again, an issue that men should talk about. But how many academics, how many university groups condemned Movember, the prostate cancer awareness and fundraising campaign, because, it was sexist? It was a privileged initiative, didn't really understand the plight and struggle of women. This is not to say that men are so challenged by the world that we can't get through. It's to recognize that there are issues where men indeed are victimized by the system. And to not be able to discuss those is incredibly offensive. And this is why it's so unsurprising, yet still shameful, that Dr. Young can't even get her work reviewed. Because people don't even want to entertain the possibility that she's right, which to me only proves that she is. When we come back in just a couple of moments, more Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media. Stay with us.
Irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
Well, it wouldn't be another week without another great example, or, like 47, of campus political correctness nonsense. But this one has to take the cake. And I must preface this by saying that when this story first emerged, I was incredibly skeptical, to say the least. I still have a healthy dose of skepticism, but I'm becoming a believer simply because now we know more information that seems to corroborate what happens. But the story is about an exchange that took place, an altercation on the campus of San Francisco State University, when a white student with dreadlocks was confronted by a black female student with dreadlocks because of cultural appropriation. See, this is just too good to be true. I didn't catch it on video, rather. It was caught on video. I watched it on video, and I'm like, this must be staged. There's no possible way. Shame on me for not realizing that this is exactly the kind of thing that happens in reality. I'm going to play a little bit of the audio from the video because you need to hear what's going on more than you need to see what's going on. But I want you to listen very closely here at the level of logic, or lack thereof, employed by the social justice warrior who had confronted him.
You're saying that I can't have a hairstyle because of your culture?
Yeah,
Why?
because it's my culture. Do you know what box means?
Do you know it was in Egyptian culture? Are you Egyptian? Nah, bro, I'm not.
Are you Egyptian?
No, but it doesn't matter.
Wait, where's Egypt? Tell me.
You know what, girl?
Where's Egypt?
Dude, go. You have no right to tell me what I can not get. Huh?
Where's Egypt?
And then he's trying to walk away. She's actually blocking him. She's actually pushing him. Then she grabs his wrist and drags him back so the lecture can continue.
Makes such some shit because of what the hair I have? That's no reason, yo. I don't need your disrespect. I don't need your disrespect.
Why are you filming this?
Just for everyone's safety.
And then she grabs the camera after saying, "Why are you filming this?" Again, this just looked too good to be true. A social justice warrior quite literally attacking a white student and blocking a camera. Now, these two have been identified. This is not a social experiment. This is actually a real-life example of where society has drifted. And I must say, I rarely find myself siding with the type of people who would have their hair as dreadlocks, even though they are white men. I rarely find myself on their team here. And I'm still not. I still think his hair looks ridiculous. But I also think that her claim that it's cultural appropriation is absurd. Isn't imitation the sincerest form of flattery? Isn't that something we were all taught at a very young age? Not so, apparently. I will say he has earned my respect for instantly coming up with the Egypt retort. The Egypt retort saying, hey, well, are you Egyptian? Because otherwise you're appropriating their culture. I think that's a very valid question. Who can really trace back the origin of any hairstyle? And even if we could, should we? He did an interview later on. Corey Goldstein is his name. The female was identified as a woman by the name of, I'm going to call her a girl because she's an immature little brat, but a student, we'll say, named Bonita. And I'm going to play something that he has said in the interviews he's done since then to try to shine light on what happened and how it happened, because I think this really helps us glimpse into the mindset of the university ilk these days.
At the time, it really felt like she was just demeaning me and demoralizing me.
Get off of me!
Come back.
Goldstein said he'd be happy to have a respectful discussion with anyone about his hair, but he has no intention of changing his look.
It's something that I've had since I was about 17 years old and something that is part of who I am. I believe they are powerful and helped amplify myself and help me connect to this world.
The university says it is investigating the video and confirms the student who took the video has requested charges be filed against Tyndall.
Now, that came from ABC 7 in San Francisco. The reason I played that is because I wanted you to hear his explanation as to why he has the hairdo. See, he's lost me there. I wish he went with, you know what, who cares? It's my hair, it's my business. But it is. And this is the problem with this social justice interventionist culture here. We all believe that we have the right to tell other people how to live their lives because we are offended by it. Now, in the case of Bonita Tyndall, she actually physically engaged, tried to block him from walking away, tried to force him into respectful dialogue, which was very disrespectful on her part, I might add. And had he walked away and pushed her out of the way, I'm sure then he would be the one facing charges because, after all, you're a man. You cannot be the oppressed. You are only the oppressor. White male on a university campus versus a black female. We know who loses in the human rights hierarchy here. She's got 2 points in human rights bingo. If she's a lesbian, she can add a third one. I don't know yet if that's the road we're going to go down with this. But then we have the true proof of University Stockholm Syndrome here. Goldstein, 22 years old, an environmental sciences major, even though he has been victimized by the PC cult, he's still also a part of it. This is a clip of an interview he did with Express Video, a YouTube channel, and he was explaining before it got up to this point about how he doesn't even think that dreadlocks are part of the African American community. He then shot himself in the foot with this comment, I thought.
When people wear Native American headdresses, I feel like that is cultural appropriation because that is something that solely is within their culture that they use for power, and only people of high standing within that community can have headdresses. And that would be cultural appropriation. But someone having locks, which is found universally across the world, not just within African culture, but everywhere actually, that is not cultural appropriation in my view.
So he's saying that, okay, well, there is some stuff that is cultural appropriation, but not this, not me. And this is the problem with universities, that the left starts to cannibalize its own here. He's not some free-thinking conservative, it sounds like. He's one of these open-minded university campus hippies, the kind who would probably be hitting people for their own political incorrectness in other contexts as well. In this case, it just so happens to be him that's fending off the accusations. And this is why it's important that the left realizes, but I don't actually want them to. It's important for us to realize this about the left, there's a better way of putting it, that they will self-cannibalize if this goes on. You can only microaggress yourself so much or accuse others of microaggressing you before you've lost people to defend you. You've lost people who can stand up for you or even for themselves. And, you know, I got to be honest, I'm not a huge Bill Maher fan. I respect him. I respect him as a comedian. I respect him as a very consistent figure. I mean, I don't agree with his positions on a lot of things, but he is consistent on them. But one area where I have always agreed with him immensely is that of political correctness. He is firmly against it. And firmly in favor of mocking those who embrace it, which is one of my favorite pastimes as well on this program and even off the program. Like, I don't need to call it work to do it. I do this in my own time. But he had a great little bit that he did on his show recently about students at Emory in the United States who claimed they were triggered by Donald Trump. Emory University students complained that they felt unsafe and they were in emotional pain because someone wrote Trump 2016 in chalk on the campus. I kid you not. I'm not a Trump fan, but he does not cause me pain, nor do I fear the very mention of his name. It's like Voldemort, I guess, he who must not be named. But this is actually where academia has brought us down to. Bill Maher wasn't having any of it on a recent show on Real Time on HBO.
I'm always criticizing what goes on college campuses. There was a doozy this week at Emory University. Oh, my gosh. You know what happened at Emory?
Talk to me.
I can't almost say it. Somebody wrote pro-Trump messages on the sidewalk in chalk.
Oh.
And I swear to God, the kids went apeshit.
It seemed in chalk, as permanent as we thought his run for president was going to be.
One student said, "I legitimately feared for my life. I thought we were having a KK rally on campus."
What were the messages?
Just Trump, like Trump in 26 in chalk.
Oh my God.
Another one. I'm supposed to feel comfortable and safe, but this man, Trump, is being supported by students on our campus, as is their right in a democracy. And our administration shows by their silence they support it as well. I don't deserve to feel afraid at my school.
Oh, no.
I so badly want to drop kick these kids into a place where there is actual pain and suffering. What happened in this country?
Yeah. Physical, and this is the worst thing, they conflate emotional pain with physical pain. To the PC masses, these two things are synonymous. I kid you not. These two things mean the same as each other. To feel like you disagree with something is to apparently be subject to actual injury. And I have to echo Bill Maher's comments that these people need to be drop-kicked to a place in the world where real pain and real suffering exist. And that was on Real Time with Bill Maher on Comedy Central. Not HBO. I had HBO in my mind earlier. On Comedy Central. And I will say, to the credit of the Emory University president, James Wagner, the school did not back down. Did not back down. Now, his administration promised student activists that whoever was behind the chalkings would go through conduct violation. But for whatever reason, there seemed to be a bit of an about-face. And James Wagner instead wrote on the ground in chalk at a university event put on by Young Americans for Liberty, "Emory stands for free expression." And he wrote this in chalk on the ground, I think beside some of the Trump chalk drawings, that Emory stands for free expression. Now, the Young Americans for Liberty chapter had accused Emory of becoming, quote, a daycare where children must be shielded from bad thoughts, unquote. They actually have speech codes on their campus. A great organization in standing up for free expression called FIRE has said that Wagner, the president of the school, has a petition that he was responding to asking Emory to further engage in public dialogue concerning academic inquiry, free speech, diversity, and community inclusion. And the petition was asking the school to affirm these things. And it seems like he has. It seems like he has not consumed the Kool-Aid just yet. And there was a letter by alumni that also went in favor of motivating the school, encouraging the school to stand up for free speech. You know, whatever happened to this belief that someone didn't need to stand up for free speech because it remained as a constant? That's a question that I have. You know, I don't think I've ever told this story on the podcast before, but a few years ago, I think it was back in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 2013, I went to Tennessee with a group from my church. And we visited Smoky Mountains National Park. If you've never been, it's an absolutely wonderful park to visit. It's not the Rockies, I assure you, but it still is a great park to see. And I had never been to an American national park before, ever before. So this was a new experience for me. And I saw in the park a number of signs near some of the visitor areas. I kid you not, First Amendment expression area. I kid you not, First Amendment expression area. They actually had signs advertising that, hey, the Smoky Mountains National Park embraces free speech in these particular areas. Now, not being an American, I was a tad confused by this. Because, you know what, I had this naive assumption that the whole country was a First Amendment expression area. But no, they had signs posted that said, quote, "This area has been set aside for individuals and groups exercising their constitutional First Amendment rights. The National Park Service neither encourages nor discourages or otherwise endorses these activities." And they put First Amendment, by the way, in quotation marks, as though it's some sort of cute experiment rather than a unifying and timeless concept. So at first I was like, oh, wow, First Amendment, great. And then I was like, wait a minute. They think that you have to designate a zone where free speech applies. And universities are moving to that point as well, where the standard, the norm, the accepted constant is that this is not there. This does not exist. And we need to reaffirm or affirm that it does. And how dangerous a fall from grace is that for a free country or for a free society? Whether it's happening in the United States or happening in Canada, it's something that should terrify people. And I joked at the beginning of the segment that, look, we can bring up examples of crazy university and college antics and find a myriad number every week. And we can laugh at them, we can mock them. But we also need to borrow language from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau here to look at the root causes and say, okay, why is it we have so many of these? Why is it that this is so routine? And look at what Professor Katherine Young said in the previous segment here. that because of the lack of popularity and the conclusions that she and her co-author reach in much of their research, they can't even get academia to entertain it. Because they disagree with it, they say, nope, I'm not going to review your book. I'm not going to acknowledge your research. I'm not going to allow you to speak here. This is what free speech has become. Majority rule as to which opinions are actually warranting free speech. So-called free speech, I should qualify that by saying. And no, it's not just universities that are bastions of this politically correct thought, and it's certainly not limited to North America. There was a piece I read just before I started recording the podcast this week about teachers demanding schools stop promoting British values, in quotation marks, because apparently cultural relativism might be offensive to immigrant children. Now, this came from the National Union of Teachers, a huge organization in the United Kingdom that says focus instead on general themes like democracy, law, and traditions, but don't under any circumstances call them British values. Because that would lead to, I kid you not, beliefs of, quote, cultural supremacy, unquote. And instead encourage international human rights. Yeah, why don't we encourage Saudi Arabian human rights? Why don't we encourage Iranian human rights? Why don't we encourage Cuban human rights? Because not all human rights codes are created equally, and certainly not all countries, and by extension cultures, are created equally. One of the things a representative of the union said, Christopher Denson, is that, quote, we need to fight to reject this notion of British values, to fight for notions of human values and human rights. We have to stand together across communities to bring down barriers, to bring down borders, to say no to Islamophobia, say no to anti-Semitism, no to fascism, and any form of racism, unquote. So wouldn't that mean criticizing cultures where fascism is the norm? Criticizing cultures where anti-Semitism is the norm? Criticizing cultures where racism is ingrained in it? What about apartheid-era South Africa? Could that not be criticized because, we don't want them to feel cultural inferiority? Some cultures deserve to be criticized. Some cultures must be criticized. Some cultures, it is absolutely imperative that we assert our own cultural superiority over. But what do I know? I'm just a colonial apologist. And on that happy note, I have to bid farewell for the show today, but I want to, as always, invite you to reach out to me and email me your thoughts, or tweet me at Andrew Lawton, or you can email me to Andrew at am980.ca about anything we covered on this program. We'll be back next week with more of Lawton Online here on the rebel.media. I want to thank you very much for tuning in, Canada. I'm Andrew Lawton. Thank you, God bless, and have a great week.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out the rebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.